Join the coven. Strings. A story written by Devil_Juice. I haven't had control over my own actions for the past 10 years. It wasn't a sudden, jarring change when it began. It was more so an insidious settling in of sorts, much like a deadly disease that begins with a light cough. I don't know for sure when I caught it, per se, though I do have a pretty good idea of when it might have happened. My then fiancé and I had gone to a comedy club on a date. It was a dingy little venue, not the sort of place you'd ever expect to see anyone even halfway famous. Higher-end places didn't exactly fit into our budget at the time. All the same, though, we ended up having a really great time. The headliner was a local, small-time act, but you could tell from his performance that he wasn't going to be small-time for much longer. I swear, that man was one of the best stand-up comedians that I ever had the pleasure of seeing, on TV or otherwise. That same night, I was struck with an inspiration of sorts. Not the usual little vague feeling I'd occasionally get when I came up with a semi-decent idea for my writing. No, this time was something different, something stronger. It was as if a muse had taken hold of my very being and was ready to guide my hand as soon as I put pen to paper. Needless to say, I didn't exactly try to restrain this feeling. Over the next few days, on my off time and in between waiting tables, I wrote a full screenplay. This was a tad bit out of the norm for me, as my usual fare was short stories and the occasional half-baked attempt at a novel. My writing itself was different as well, no longer filled with the starts and stops of indecision and self-doubt. My pen flew across the paper with a singular purpose that I had never quite experienced before. It was powerful, meaningful even. When I held the complete draft of it in my hands at the end of it all, I felt a sense of completeness. Somehow I knew I had made something worthwhile. Looking back on it now, I knew it was then that it had truly started to take hold of me. I had no way of knowing then, but it was already too late for me. Things moved surprisingly quickly after that. I got in contact with a production company and, almost before I knew it, my screenplay was becoming a full Hollywood production. It all seemed too good to be true. Suddenly, everything in my life seemed to be falling into place. My fiancé and I went from living paycheck to paycheck in rural Kentucky to living the sort of high life that we had always half-jokingly dreamed about. I could scarcely believe it was all really happening. I pinched myself more than just a few times in those first few months before I truly had myself convinced of the truth of it all. I took the majority of the profit I had made off the initial sale of the script and gave my now wife the wedding of her dreams. Maybe it was a bit irresponsible of me to spend that much money after having just made it, but I felt the gesture was only fitting. Even as we struggled along every day, barely managing to pay our bills, she always believed in me and supported me in my dream of being a writer. The success I had suddenly found was as much hers as it was my own. A nice wedding was the very least I could do for her. and was only the beginning of what I had planned for our future together. Besides, it was more or less a certainty at that point that more money would soon be on the way. The height of success, unfortunately, didn't last much longer after that. I was sitting in the audience for the premiere of my movie when I first saw them. At first, they were indistinct little glints that I could only just slightly catch sight of when the light hit them just right. The more I found my eyes focusing on them, though, the clearer they started to become. Eventually, I finally realized what they were. A set of threads stretching upwards from my ankles and wrists to an indeterminate location above me, like a puppet's strings. I chuckled a bit, joking to myself that it was likely the work of a spider with a sick sense of humor. I moved to brush them away. But I didn't. Perplexed, I tried again, but my limbs would not obey me. I couldn't move. And that was just the beginning of the waking nightmare my life has become. All of a sudden, with seemingly no warning, I had become a passive observer in a life that was no longer my own. My body moved as normal, going about my life and doing all the things I would normally choose to do on my own. Yet, I was very much so not the one choosing. It was like walking through a door in a video game and suddenly losing control of your character as a cutscene begins. My cutscene, though, was seemingly never ending. However, I quickly realized that I wasn't the only one. The first person other than myself that I had seen with the strings was my agent. He was the person who had gotten me my first movie deal and was meeting with me that day to discuss my new script that would soon become my second. I say my script, but I suppose it wasn't really mine in the truest sense. I hadn't exactly written it on my own. I had been there for the whole process, sure, but it was all the strings work. I wasn't even really all that fond of it. My agent absolutely loved it, though, and when I saw the strings rising upwards to the sky from each of his limbs, I realized that I had a pretty good idea why. I thought about a lot of things that day, sitting idly in that office. Had the strings truly only just caught hold of me in that theater? Perhaps they had been with me for even longer, guiding me with an unseen hand before I had even noticed them. Had I actually earned any of my success? Or had it been just given to me? There was really no way to tell, and I seriously doubted I'd ever get an explanation out of a few pieces of thread. After that, I started to see the strings everywhere. I saw them attached to the actors in my movies, passers-by on the street, politicians, and even a few homeless people I happened to come across. The prospect of so many people not being in control of their own actions was terrifying to me. Who or what was controlling us? What was their purpose in doing so? Questions like this ran rampant in my caged mind for months, filling me with so much dread that it felt like I could drown in it. In fact, I almost did. However, eventually, I just sort of gave up. Despite my constant existential dread, it wasn't like I really had the choice to do anything about it anymore. Besides, shouldn't I be somewhat grateful? In truth, the strings had happened to make my life so much better. Clearly, things could have turned out a whole lot worse for me, depending on the whims of those ethereal bits of thread. Maybe I'd just be better off enjoying the ride. I was naive. I didn't recognize the woman that showed up at my door that day while my wife was out. She was a complete stranger to me, beautiful and scantily clad. I wasn't looking at her body, though. My gaze was instead drawn to the all too familiar strings, stretching endlessly from her limbs and up into the sky. I invited her inside. I didn't try to hide my infidelity from my beautiful wife. The strings wouldn't even let me try. Soon enough, she was gone. I had lost her, the love of my life. And with her, I had lost any hope for a happy future. I was completely alone. Not even my family would have anything to do with me after what I had done. I couldn't blame them, really. I thought it wasn't by any choice of my own. I had completely fallen into the trope of a person who becomes an a-hole immediately after gaining even a little bit of fame. I wouldn't have wanted to have anything to do with me either. I just wrote mindlessly after that. I churned out movie after movie, each of them somewhere in between subpar and awful. I felt utterly broken. There was nothing left in the way of passion for my work anymore. It hurt less when I stopped caring about anything at all. I did take some small comfort in the endless scratching of pen against paper, though, as well as my abundant supply of cheap scotch. I certainly hadn't enjoyed it when the strings first forced the bottle to my lips, but I had quickly learned to love it. I welcomed any opportunity to simply not feel. Lately, I've been working on a romantic comedy of sorts. If I had any control over my lips, I wouldn't have been able to call it a comedy with the straight look on my face. In my honest opinion, it was a soulless piece of garbage akin to late Adam Sandler vehicles. It was a work that relied on the star power of the cast rather than the quality of its content in order to turn a profit. That, and way too many poorly timed and poorly executed fart jokes. This isn't the sort of opinion I'd normally have the ability to share, though. I did end up meeting a familiar face, though. The lead actor was actually the same comedian I had seen in that comedy club all those years ago. He looked older now, so much more tired and empty of the vibrant good humor that used to almost burst out from him. It was like looking into a mirror, complete with those damnable strings. His sad gaze strayed to above my head. His face smiled, independent of his own free will. But in his gaze, I saw recognition, knowing, and the sort of gnawing guilt that eats you from inside until there's nothing left. Now reading this, I'm sure you're likely wondering, if you're unable to control your own actions, then how are you even writing this? Surely the strings wouldn't allow you to do so, based off what you said so far. The simple fact of the matter, though, is that I'm still very much so not in control of my actions. In all these years, there hasn't been a single moment that the strings have relinquished control over me. As always, they are forcing me to write this. Even now, I have no idea what their goal is. Everything they do seems completely random. Maybe there really isn't some sort of deeper meaning to the things the strings make us do. Perhaps the unseen puppeteer, if there even is one, simply enjoys playing with our lives. Still though, I can't help but find myself thinking that there has to be some sort of greater design, an end goal of sort, a reason for all this madness. But it's like trying to solve a puzzle from the perspective of one of the pieces I could never hope to fully understand. I do have some idea, though, as to why it's announcing its presence in this manner. It's just a guess, really, but given what I've experienced so far, I feel pretty confident that I'm right about this. Not that it does any sort of good at this point. All I can say is that I am truly so very sorry for doing this to you all. I hope, with all my heart, that you didn't read this all the way to the end.